The rushlight had guttered low in the cottage at Clavering, in the county of Essex. Outside, a March wind moved over the thatch, and inside, Richard Chesham lay curled beneath a rough wool blanket, his throat burning, his hands cold. A cracked earthenware bowl sat on the floor beside the bed, still half full of rice, still faintly warm. His wife moved quietly at the hearth, stirring a pot with a wooden spoon, humming something under her breath. She did not look at him. She had not looked at him for some hours. The parish surgeon would come in the morning, and neither he nor the coroner would understand what they were seeing. Somewhere down the lane, a dog barked once and fell still. And in that low, close room, with the fire ticking to embers, the slow, patient work of Arsenic went on. The village at Clavering. Good evening, and welcome. Welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small around you. I am glad you are here. Before we begin, I would love to know where you are listening from, and what hour it is on your side of the night. Perhaps it is late and the house is asleep. Perhaps it is early, and the rain has not yet started. Wherever you are, and whatever the hour, settle in. If you have a moment, please subscribe to the channel, and give this video a like. It costs you nothing, and it helps a small channel like this one keep telling these old, quiet stories to the people who love them. Now, let us begin. Let us drift backward together, past the streets you know and the lights you can see, past the year we live in, and further still, until the road narrows and the fields open, and the wind smells of clay and cattle and cold rain, and we come to the parish of Clavering, in the county of Essex, on the border of Hertfordshire, in the middle years of the 19th century. The village of Clavering is small. Even now, it is small. In the 1840s, it was smaller and quieter and darker after nightfall than most of us can easily picture. There are no street lamps here. There is no gas. When the sun goes down over the fields, the only lights are the low red squares of cottage windows and the yellow smear of a lantern moving up a lane, and, on a market night, the fire outside the smithy. The stars are extraordinary. If you have ever stood in the countryside on a moonless night with no houses near you, you know how many stars there really are. The people of Clavering see that sky every night of their lives, and they do not think it remarkable. They only pull their shawls tighter and go inside. Let us walk the parish for a moment before we come to any single house. The land here is Essex clay. In summer it cracks. In winter it holds water and turns to a heavy, sucking mud that pulls the boots off small children and makes the horses tired long before their day's work is done. The fields lie in strips and squares, hedged with hawthorn and blackthorn, and along the hedges there are elms, still standing then, tall and old, before the sickness of a later century took them. Wheat grows here. Barley grows here. There are pigs in the yards, and geese by the ponds, and cows kept for milk in a shed behind the house. The parish sits between the small market towns of Newport, 3 miles or so to the east, and Saffron Walden, a little further off, and the great London road runs past, near enough that a man in Clavering hears the mail coach at night if the wind is right. I have to say something quickly, in my own voice, before we go on. I have never seen the parish register of Clavering with my own hands. Others have. There are people who have spent years with those pages, and I owe them a great deal for what I am about to tell you. Where the record does not agree with itself, I will say so as we go. Where a thing is guessed at rather than known, I will mark it for you. I would rather admit to a gap than pretend the past is neater than it is. The village itself gathers around a green, and around the parish church of Saints Mary and Clement, which stands on rising ground above the lane. The church is old. Parts of it are much older than the story we are here for. Its tower has watched a great many funerals go by, most of them small, most of them forgotten before the end of the winter that carried them. The bells rang for births and marriages and deaths, and the villagers came in on Sundays in their best clothes, which for many of them were only a cleaner version of their working clothes, and they sat in the pews and listened to the vicar and thought, most of them, about the fields waiting outside. Around the church there are cottages. Some are timber-framed with the plaster showing and the beams dark with age. Some are brick, low and squat, roofed with old red tiles. The poorest are of clay lump, a kind of unbaked mud brick that the county made much use of in those years, thatched with straw or reed. A clay lump cottage in Essex in the 1840s is a small, warm, damp place. It has one room downstairs, sometimes two. It has a loft above, reached by a ladder or a narrow stair. Its walls are thick and its ceilings are low. A tall man must stoop, though most men in the village are not tall. The years of poor food and hard work have kept them shorter than we would expect. Their wives are shorter still. You have to picture the smell of such a cottage, because the smell is half of what the past really was, and it is the part the record almost never keeps. There is wood smoke first, always, because the fire is never truly out. There is tallow, from the cheap candles the poor could afford, and the fatty smoke of a rushlight, which is a peeled rush dipped in old kitchen grease. There is the smell of boiled cabbage and boiled bacon. There is the sourness of the pig, kept close by. There is the sweetness of hay in the loft. There is damp plaster after rain, and there is the earthy smell of the clay floor, sometimes strewn with straw or rushes, sometimes only swept. Once you have that in your mind, you have half the village. The people of Clavering in these years work the land. Some own a small plot. Most do not. Most are labourers who go out at dawn to whichever farmer has hired them for the week, and come home at dusk, and eat and sleep and go out again. The men earn perhaps 9 shillings a week, sometimes less, sometimes a little more in the reaping. The women earn far less than that, in the fields at harvest, or in stone picking, or in glove making at home in the evenings, or in taking in washing. Children work as soon as they can be useful. A boy of 7 might be scaring crows in a barley field for a farthing a day. A girl of 9 might be minding smaller children while her mother knelt in the wet mud, gleaning the last of the corn. We are going to meet a woman named Sarah Chesham in this parish. You already know her name. You already know a little of what she is remembered for. I want you to try, if you can, to set that knowledge aside for the length of this chapter, and see her as her neighbours saw her before the whispers began, because that is where the real weight of this story lives. Sarah Chesham is, in the year we are picturing, a farmer's wife. She was born, so the parish record has it, Sarah Parker, and we will come to her girlhood in the next chapter. In this one, she is a woman of middle age. She lives in a cottage on the edge of the village, with her husband Richard, who is a small farmer, or something very close to a small farmer, working a little land of his own and hiring out his labour when the season required it. They have children. The exact number and the exact order we will handle carefully when we come to it, because the parish register spells one of the names 2 ways, and I have never worked out which she preferred. Their cottage is one of the low, thatched ones, and its door opens onto a lane that runs down toward the fields. The kitchen is the heart of it. In an Essex labourer's cottage in the 1840s, the kitchen is not a room set aside for cooking. The kitchen is the room. It is where the food is prepared and eaten. It is where the fire burns. It is where the family sits in the evenings, and where the children do their small tasks by candlelight, and where the wife of the house mends stockings and skirts and shirts until her eyes ache. It is where a neighbour is welcomed with a cup of small beer or a mug of tea, if there is tea in the tin. Its floor is beaten earth or laid brick. Its ceiling is crossed by black oak beams from which hang bunches of dried herbs and, in season, strings of onions, and now and then a joint of bacon cured in the chimney. Above the hearth is an iron crane, from which a pot hangs on a hook. The pot is nearly always on. Sarah Chesham keeps her kitchen well. Her neighbours will remember that, later, and they will remember it uneasily, because a neat kitchen and a poisoning wife did not go together in their minds, and they had to find room for both. Her floor is swept. Her table is scrubbed. Her tin cups hang from nails driven into the shelf above the hearth. There is a small dresser against one wall, with a few plates and a jug for milk and a wooden salt box. There is a copper on a little brick stand for boiling water and washing linen. There is a wooden trough for kneading bread. There is a cracked earthenware bowl, of no importance yet, which will matter very much later. She is known in the village. She is asked into other cottages to sit with a woman in childbed, or to lay out a body, or to help nurse a sick child through a bad night. This is what village women did for one another in that century. There is no district nurse. The parish doctor is in Newport, and to fetch him costs money, and money is thin. So when a child of 5 in the next lane is burning with fever, and the mother has 3 younger ones to see to, and no sleep in her, she sends for a neighbour who has a steady pair of hands, and that neighbour comes, and she brings what she has. Sarah Chesham, in these years, is one of the neighbours who comes. The record does not say what she thought of the walk down the lane on such a night, or what she carried under her shawl. I would like to tell you, but I will not invent it. What I can tell you is that a woman making such a walk in Clavering in the 1840s would have gone in near perfect darkness, with the wind pulling at her bonnet and the mud pulling at her clogs, and she would have known every hedge and gate by feel. The parish was small enough that a wife could name every child by the sound of its cough. We have to leave the kitchen for a moment and step outside, because the village is more than the 4 walls of any one house. On a market day in the 1840s, Clavering itself is quiet, but Newport, 3 miles off, is not. Newport is where the farmers of the parish take their eggs, their butter, their fowl, their small surplus of grain. Newport is where a labourer's wife might sell a shilling's worth of gathered watercress in season. Newport is where you buy the things a village cannot make. Salt. Sugar, if you can afford it. Tea, in a very small twist of paper. A yard of calico for a new apron. And, in a shop on the high street, over a wooden counter, without any question asked and without any paper signed, arsenic. That last sentence has to sit for a moment. In the England of the 1840s, you could walk into a chemist's shop, or a grocer's shop, or a general store in a market town, and buy an ounce of white arsenic for a penny or 2, and no one would think it strange. It was sold for rats. It was sold for mice. It was sold to kill flies on a sickly summer joint of meat. It was sold, in the country parishes, in quantities that a modern reader can hardly believe. Farmers dressed their seed corn with it. Housewives kept a little on a shelf. Children were sent to fetch it, sometimes wrapped in the same square of paper as a farthing's worth of pepper. The law had not yet caught up with what the shopkeepers were doing. It will catch up, in the story we are here for, and Sarah Chesham will be part of the reason. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and that is not how this story wants to be told. In the year we are still picturing, the summer of, let us say, the year 1844, Sarah Chesham is still only a farmer's wife on the edge of Clavering. Her name is not yet whispered in the tap room of the Cock, the old inn on the road. Her name is not yet used as a warning by mothers to daughters. She is only a woman in a plain dark gown, with a white cap over her hair, and a shawl about her shoulders when the evening turns cold, and a soft Essex accent that shortens the ends of her words and stretches the middles. You have to picture her at her door in the last light of a summer evening. The fields beyond the lane are still warm. The swallows are still cutting across the sky above the barn. Somewhere along the hedge a blackbird is singing, hard and clear, the way blackbirds do at that hour. A cart goes by, drawn by a tired horse, and the driver lifts a hand, and she lifts a hand back. Inside the cottage her children are quiet. The pot is on the crane. The fire is banked for the night. Everything about her, at this moment, is as ordinary as any other wife in any other cottage in Essex. And that is the thing to hold on to, at the very start, because the whole horror of what is coming lies exactly there. History does not open a poisoning case with an obvious monster. It opens with a woman closing a door for the night, and a village going to sleep around her, and the wind moving over the thatch, and no one, not yet having any reason to be afraid. A girl from the Marshes. She was born Sarah Parker. That much the parish books hold, and the ink is old enough now that a finger drawn across the page would smudge nothing. Where she was born is a harder question. The record disagrees with itself. One clerk set her birth in a hamlet near Clavering itself, another in a village a few miles off toward the Cambridgeshire border, and a third, in a much later account written for a London paper, in the flat country that stretches east toward the marshes of the Blackwater. I cannot tell you which of the three is right. I can only tell you that the girl who would one day be called Sally Arsenic in the taprooms of Newport began her life somewhere on the Essex clay, in a labourer's cottage, in the last years of the Regency, when a household loaf cost 7pence, and a working man was thought fortunate to earn 10 shillings in a week. Let us take her, for the length of this chapter, into the country of her girlhood, whatever its exact name. You have to picture a landscape that is not the pretty England of the paintings. This is Essex in the 1820s. It is flat. It is wet. Its lanes are unmetalled and, in a bad autumn, turn to deep brown ruts that will hold a cart wheel to the axle. Its ditches run broad and are dark with reeds. Its cottages string themselves along the roads in ones and twos, roofed with thatch that goes black at the ridge, walled with clay lump or old brick, some so low that a grown man must bend his head to cross the threshold. In the distance, a church tower marks the parish. Closer by, a windmill turns, or does not turn, depending on the day. Rooks lift out of the elms and settle back into the elms and lift out of them again, and the sound of them is one of the first sounds a child in that country ever learns. I have to say a thing in my own voice before we go further. The girlhood of a poor Essex labourer's daughter in the year 1822 is one of the least documented lives in English history. No one wrote her letters. She wrote none herself, so far as anyone has ever found. Her name appears in a baptismal entry, and later in a marriage entry, and then it vanishes for years at a stretch until misfortune or crime prints it in a court paper. Almost everything we can say about her early years is said about the world she lived in, not about her, and I would rather admit that at the start than let you think I know more than I do. So the girl you will meet in these paragraphs is Sarah in outline. The colour we can put on that outline is honest, because it is the colour every other girl of her sort was living inside. Her father was a labourer. That is nearly certain. Labouring men made up the great bulk of the Essex countryside in these years, and Parker was a labouring name in every parish for miles. He worked on other men's land. He was paid by the day in summer and by the week in winter, and there were weeks in the cold months when he was paid nothing at all, because the ground was hard and no farmer would send him out. On those weeks his family lived on what had been laid down against the season: a little flour, a little bacon in the chimney, a barrel of salt beans, a jar of pig's fat for the pan. When the beans ran low, they thinned the pot with turnip. When the flour ran low, the mother put more water in the dumplings, and the children ate them anyway, because a hot dumpling in a cold room is a comfort out of all proportion to what is in it. Her mother, in all likelihood, worked as hard as the father, and for less. In the harvest weeks she was in the field beside him, gleaning after the reapers, gathering the last spilt ears of wheat into her apron, so the family could grind them into a rough dark flour that no baker would have sold. In the winter she was at home, but home was not rest. She washed for the vicarage, perhaps, or for the wife of a farmer with a growing family, kneeling at a wooden trough with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her hands raw with lye. She made gloves at night by the fire, stitching stiff dogskin fingers by the yellow flicker of a rushlight. She had children every second or third year, and buried at least one of them, and named a later one after the one she had lost. This is not a guess. This is the shape of the life. Two neighbours would have given different accounts of which children lived and which did not, and both would have been certain. The girl grew up in a room that was almost never empty. Elder brothers and sisters filled it before her, and younger brothers and sisters came in after, and there were often others besides. A widowed aunt might be sleeping by the hearth. A cousin sent from another parish because a mother had died in her lying-in might be sharing the loft. The bed she slept in was shared with two of her sisters, head to foot, under a blanket that had been patched so many times the patches themselves bore patches. In the winter, when the wind came off the flats and found every gap in the plaster, the three of them slept in their clothes and their shawls, and their breath rose in a single pale cloud above their heads, and in the morning the water in the tin jug on the sill was frozen through. By 6 she was working. This must startle a modern ear, and it startles me too when I think of it hard, but it is what the parish did with its poor children in the 1820s. She would have been sent into the barley at scaring time, standing all day at the edge of a field with a wooden rattle in her hand, jerking it into life whenever the crows came near, for a farthing or two if the farmer was decent, and a heel of bread if he was not. Later she would have been set to stone-picking, which is exactly what its name says, walking a fresh-ploughed field with a hessian sack, picking out the flints so the horses would not lame themselves at harrowing. Later still she would have been sent into a farmhouse kitchen at hiring time, at 10 or 11 years old, to peel potatoes and fetch water and light the copper fires, and to sleep, if she was lucky, in a straw pallet in the scullery, and to walk home once a quarter, with her wages tied in a corner of her handkerchief. I want you to stop for a heartbeat and imagine that walk home. She is 11, perhaps 12. It is a Sunday in November. The lanes are already going to mud. She has 3 shillings in a knot at her hip, which is a fortune. She has been up since 4:30 every day for the last 3 months. She has thick, chapped, red hands and eyes that itch from smoke, and she is walking 3 miles across country to a cottage she has not seen since August, and when she comes to the door, her mother will meet her and take the 3 shillings from the handkerchief, and set out 1 shilling for her, and put 2 into the tin on the shelf, and kiss her on the top of the head, and set her to peeling turnips for the pot. This is not a hardship story told for pity. This is a girlhood, in that county, in that decade, told straight. I have never been able to work out what a childhood of this kind does to the person who lives it. Others have written whole books on the question, and I do not pretend to answer it here. What I can say, and what the record does support, is that a girl raised like this learns very early to keep her thoughts to herself. She learns that a bruise heals faster if you do not speak of it. She learns that a farmer's wife will forgive a slow morning if you have been up in the night with her sick child, and that a farmer will not. She learns which lanes are safe after dark. She learns the price of everything, to the halfpenny, because a halfpenny lost is a supper missed. She learns, and this is important, the uses of every plant that grows in the hedge, because her mother taught her, and her mother's mother taught her mother, and the country wisdom of an English parish in 1828 was still, in most respects, the wisdom of 1800 and of 1700 before it. We will come, in later chapters, to what she may have known about poison, and I will handle it then with the care it requires. In this chapter, I want only to say this. A girl of Sarah Parker's world grew up in easy reach of things that could kill. Foxglove grew along the ditch. Hemlock stood by the water. Deadly nightshade was known and warned against. A cottage kept ratsbane on the shelf as calmly as it kept flour, and the ratsbane was arsenic, and everybody knew it was arsenic, and nobody thought that strange, because rats came in every autumn out of the fields and ate the winter store, and a countrywoman fought them with what she had. The knowledge was ordinary. The uses of the knowledge were not, and never, in one country wife in 1,000, in 10,000, would that knowledge turn to what Sarah Chesham's would turn to. But she grew up with it in the room, as every girl of her sort grew up with it, and that is the fact to hold. Church came weekly, at first because her mother took her, and later because the parish expected it. The church was cold. The pew was hard. The vicar was a man in a black gown who read from a book she could not read for herself. She learned the shape of the prayers by hearing them, and she said them back without always knowing what the words meant, in the way of children in that century. She learned that God was watching, and that hell was a real place beneath the earth, and that a good wife obeyed her husband, and a bad wife was punished in this world and in the next. What she made of any of this, in her own head, is not recorded. It is easy to picture a serious little girl in a scrubbed apron, and it is also easy to picture a dreamy one who counted the beams above her head and thought of dinner. The truth is almost certainly some mixture, and the mixture is now lost. She learned to read a little, perhaps, and to write her name, perhaps, and perhaps not even that. Sunday schools were beginning to reach into the Essex parishes in the years of her girlhood, and a bright child of a labouring family might get an hour a week of the alphabet, chalked out on a slate, in a room behind the vestry. Whether Sarah Parker ever sat in such a room, I cannot say. Some accounts of her later life speak of her signing her name with a cross, in the manner of the fully illiterate, and other accounts have her writing it in a hand described as poor but readable. Both may be true. She may have learned young and forgotten, which happened often to women whose lives left no time for practice. Or the two clerks who described her signature were describing two different days. The record does not settle it. By the time she was 15, she was almost certainly out at farm service full-time, sleeping under other people's roofs, coming home for the harvest fair and for Christmas, and for the funeral of a grandmother, and going back again. By 17 she was drawing the attention of the young men of the district, in the way of any healthy country girl with strong arms and a level look, at the harvest supper and at the parish dance held in a barn cleared out for the purpose. The dance would have been lit by lanterns hung from the beams. The music would have come from a single fiddler on an upturned barrel. The floor would have been strewn with fresh straw. A boy in a clean shirt would have crossed the barn and offered her a hand, and she would have taken it, or not, and gone back afterwards to sit with the older women along the wall, and the older women would have watched her with the sharp, kind, appraising eyes with which country parishes have always watched their marriageable daughters. Somewhere in that world, in the last of the 1830s, a young man named Richard Chesham came into her line of sight. He was of the same county and the same class, a labourer with the hope of a small holding of his own, and by all the evidence a respectable, hard-working man. Whether they met at a dance, at a fair, at chapel, or across a hedge on a Sunday walk, the record does not say, and I will not pretend otherwise. What the record does say, plainly and without decoration, is that in the year 1828, at a small parish church on the Essex clay, Sarah Parker put her hand into the hand of Richard Chesham and answered a vicar in the words the vicar required, and walked out of that church a farmer's wife. The rain had held off that morning. The bells had rung above the yew trees in the churchyard. A friend or two had scattered a handful of rice at the door, and somewhere beyond the lane, unnoticed, an autumn wind moved across the fields she had known all her life, and turned toward the parish of Clavering, where a cottage on the edge of the village was already waiting for her, with its low ceiling and its hearth and its shelf above the door, and, in time, the cracked earthenware bowl that no one yet had any reason to fear. The farmer's wife. She came into Clavering as a bride in the late autumn of 1828, and the parish took her in without much ceremony, because a labouring wife in a labouring village is not, in that century, a thing to make a fuss over. Richard Chesham brought her up the lane in a borrowed cart, with a bundle of her possessions on the boards behind her, and set her down at the door of a cottage that would be theirs for the rest of her married life. The bundle held 2 changes of linen, a second cap, a wooden comb, a Bible she may or may not have been able to read, and a copper pan her mother had pressed into her hands at the parting. That was the whole of what she carried. Everything else in the cottage was Richard's, or had come with the tenancy, or would have to be built up between them in the years ahead. I want to stop for a heartbeat and tell you what a young farmer's wife in that county was walking into on such a day, because the shape of her days is going to matter to everything that follows. Richard Chesham was not a rich man. He was not a poor one either, by the reckoning of the parish. He held a few acres of his own, or on a long lease from a landlord in the next 100, and he hired himself out to larger farms in the busy weeks of the year. The cottage went with the holding. It stood a little apart from the row of labourers' dwellings nearer the church, and it had, by the standards of Clavering, room to breathe. 2 rooms below, a loft above, a garden of perhaps a rood behind it, for cabbages and onions and a line of currant bushes, a pigsty at the far end, a shed for tools, a rope and bucket well by the back door, sunk into the Essex clay by some earlier tenant whose name no one had bothered to keep. The door she pushed open that first evening led into a room she would afterwards scrub and sweep every day of her married life. Its floor was of laid brick, worn to a shine in a track between the hearth and the table. Its ceiling was crossed by 2 heavy beams from which iron hooks hung down for bacon and for the drying of herbs. A settle stood beside the hearth, its wood black with years of wood smoke. A deal table filled the middle of the room, scarred by the knives of previous wives. Against the far wall stood a dresser with 3 shelves, and on the shelves a few pieces of plain earthenware in cream and blue, and a pewter mug or 2, and a tin canister for tea when there was tea. Above the hearth an iron crane swung out over the fire, and from the crane hung a heavy black pot, and the pot, from that first evening onward, was hers. Say what you will about the romance of a country cottage. The truth of it, for the wife who kept it, was a working day that began before dawn and ended after dark, and never once, in the whole cycle of the year, gave her a morning off. Sarah was up at 5 in the winter and at 4 in the summer. She raked the ashes from the hearth. She laid a fresh fire with kindling she had cut and dried herself the previous week. She struck a light with flint and steel, because friction matches were still rare and dear in an Essex parish in that decade, and she blew the fire into life on her knees, with a wooden bellows worn smooth by the hands of the tenant before her. Only then did the day properly start. The animals were fed first. A pig in the sty, if they had a pig that year. A dozen hens in a coop by the shed. A goose or 2 on the pond at the bottom of the garden, in the seasons when a goose could be spared for eggs and later for a Christmas roasting. Sarah scattered barley from a wooden bowl, and the hens came round her feet in a flurry of red and brown, and she gathered the eggs from the straw and carried them in her apron back to the house, and set them in a stone crock by the dresser, one by one, cool from the night. The pig was harder work. It ate what the family did not, and what the family did not eat in a Clavering cottage was little enough. She carried it a bucket of peelings and rinds and yesterday's cold porridge, and it pushed its blunt wet nose into the trough and grunted, and she stood a moment watching it, because the pig was, in a real and unromantic sense, the family's insurance against a bad winter. Water came next. The well behind the cottage gave up a bucket of cold clean water for every full turn of the handle, and she needed a great many turns of the handle before her day was done. Water for the pot on the crane. Water for washing the children's hands and faces. Water for the copper on its brick stand in the corner, because Monday was washing day, and washing day meant a copper full of boiling water and a wooden dolly beating the linen in a tub until her arms ached to the shoulder. She carried the water in a wooden yoke across her shoulders, 2 pails swinging, and she went back and back and back until the crocks and the coppers were all filled, and only then did she turn to the bread. Bread was baked twice a week in most cottages of that class, and Sarah baked hers on a Tuesday and a Friday, in a beehive oven built into the outside wall by the back door. She fed the oven with faggots of thorn cut from the hedge, and she waited until the bricks inside had gone white with heat, and then she raked the ash out with a long-handled peel and slid her loaves in on the same peel, 4 at a time, and shut the iron door on them, and stopped its edges with a rag of wet flour paste to keep the heat in. The loaves came out an hour later, brown and hard on the crust and soft as a pillow within, and she stood them on end on the dresser to cool, and the smell of them filled the cottage and the lane outside and the garden and reached, on a still morning, as far as the churchyard wall. I have to say a thing here, because I owe you the honest shape of the record. We do not have Sarah Chesham's own words about any of this. She left no diary. She wrote no letters that anyone has ever found. What she thought as she stood at her oven with the flour on her forearms, what she said to Richard when he came in from the field at 7 in the evening, what she sang to her children as she rocked them by the hearth. None of that has come down to us. The picture I am giving you of her working life is drawn from the working lives of 1,000 Essex women, exactly like her, whose duties were fixed by the poverty of the parish and the season of the year, and who did what she did in almost every respect. Where I cross from that broad likeness into her own kitchen, I am guessing at the colour but not at the shape, and I want you to know it as we go. Their first child came in the ordinary way of that country, and in the ordinary quickness. A parish register in Clavering records the baptism of a son not many months after the marriage, in the winter of 1829, and I will not name him here without hedging, because the entries for the Chesham household are muddled in places, and no two later commentators quite agree. What is beyond argument is that, within a decade of her walking through that cottage door as a bride, Sarah Chesham had borne several children to Richard, some of whom lived and some of whom did not. The exact ledger of them, the order and the ages, is one of the sadder puzzles of this case. 2 sons will matter very much to us in the next chapter, and we will come to their names then. In this one, they are still infants at the hearth, wrapped in flannel, held against her shoulder while she stirred the pot. You must picture a household of that period as a place in which the birth of a child and the burial of a child were only a season apart in many years. A woman of Sarah's class went into her lying in on a straw mattress in the loft, or on a truckle bed pulled close to the hearth for the warmth. A neighbour came in to catch the baby. The parish doctor was not sent for unless something had already gone wrong, and by the time something had gone wrong, it was often too late for the doctor to mend. The child, once born, was washed in warm water in the copper pan, wrapped tight from the shoulders to the toes in a length of flannel called a swaddling band, and given to the mother, who lay flat on her back for 2 days if she could afford the rest, and rose on the 3rd to see to the fire. Half the wives in Clavering knew a woman in the next lane who had died of childbed fever within the week, and the other half knew 2. The child grew or did not. It was fed at the breast for as long as the mother's milk lasted, and after that on bread soaked in warm sugared water, or on a thin gruel of oatmeal and skimmed milk from a farmer's back door, or, in the very poorest houses, on what the family had, chewed to a paste by the mother and pushed between the infant's gums with the tip of her finger. Sarah Chesham's cottage was not one of the very poorest, and her children ate what she could give them, which was better than most and worse than some, and they thrived, some of them, with the tough, surprising thriving of country children, and grew brown and bare-legged in the garden by 2, and were sent out to scare crows and pick stones by 6, as she had been. We have to leave the cradle for a moment and walk out with Richard, because his working day was every bit as fixed as hers, and it shaped the hours of her household as much as her own labour did. Richard Chesham left the cottage at first light with a bit of bread and cheese tied in a cloth. He walked to whichever field his own land or another man's field required. He ploughed in the autumn behind a pair of horses hired for the day. He drilled seed in the spring with a wooden seed fiddle strapped across his chest. He mowed hay in July with a scythe whose blade he sharpened himself on a stone by the barn door, and he raked and turned it with his children beside him. He cut wheat in August with the same scythe, or a heavier one, and he tied the sheaves and stood them up in stooks in the field to dry, and he brought them in on a wagon whose wheels bent the ruts deeper in the lane every year. When he came home at evening his boots were caked in yellow mud, and Sarah met him at the door with a jug of small beer, and she pulled his boots off for him and set them by the fire to dry, and there is a whole married life in that one small courtesy, done every night for 20 years. They kept, all this while, the shelf of things any Essex cottage kept in that decade, and I have to name what stood on it because it will matter to us before this production is out. There was flour in a lidded crock against the mice. There was salt in a small wooden box with a hinged top. There was sugar in a hard brown loaf that had to be broken up with iron nippers, when there was sugar at all. There was tea in a tin canister with a fitted lid. There was pepper. There was a little bottle of oil of cloves for the toothache. There was a jar of goose grease for chapped hands and for chest colds, There was a paper of rhubarb powder for the children's stomachs. There was, on the highest shelf, out of the reach of the smaller ones, a twist of blue paper marked with a printed skull, in which lay 2 ounces of white arsenic bought at the grocer's shop in Newport for a penny, and it had been bought for the rats, and every wife within a mile had a twist of the same on a shelf of her own, and no one thought a thing of it. Life in this fashion went on year after year. The children came, and some of them went. Richard's holding did well in a wet summer, and ill in a dry one. Sarah kept her floor swept, and her pot filled, and her linen boiled every Monday. The bells rang on Sundays over the yews of Saints Mary and Clement, and the parish went in and came out, and Sarah went with them, and stood in the pew with her cap pulled straight and her hands folded in front of her, and no one, in those first 15 years, ever pointed at her in the lane, or crossed the road to avoid her, or said her name in the tap-room of the Cock with a lowered voice. I would like to be able to leave her there, at the door of that cottage, at the good end of a working day in the middle of the 1840s, with the wheat in and the pig fat and her children round her ankles, because that is where she deserved to stay, and where a great many farmers' wives before her and after her did stay, and lived out plain useful lives and were buried in the churchyard under a stone that gave only their names and their years. That is not where the record leaves her. In the summer of 1845, the pot on the crane in her kitchen was still on, as it had been every summer of her married life, and the shelf above the dresser still held its ordinary things, and the twist of blue paper still lay in its ordinary place. But 2 of her sons were shortly to fall ill within a season of one another, and the surgeon called to their bedside was to write down, in a hand that grew more troubled with each visit, what he had seen. And the quiet years at Clavering, 20 of them run together like beads on a thread, were about to break. The rice bowl. The first of the 2 boys fell ill in the January of 1845, a fortnight after the Christmas, the parish still remembered as the coldest in a decade. His name was Joseph, and he was 10 years old that winter, a broad-shouldered boy for his age, with hands already toughened by the stone-picking and the crow-scaring, and a habit of sitting on the settle by the hearth in the evenings, with his knees drawn up and his chin on them, listening to whatever the grown people were saying, and saying nothing much himself. He came in from the yard one afternoon, complaining of his stomach. His mother wiped his face with the back of her wrist, sent him up to the loft, and told him to sleep it off. He did not sleep it off. In the night he vomited into the pail by the bed, and again toward morning, and by the second day he could keep down neither water nor the thin gruel his mother brought him. His throat, he said, was burning. He kept touching the hollow of it with the flat of his hand, as if to soothe a fire he could feel there. His skin was hot in patches and cold in others. His eyes had gone dull. Sarah sat with him through the afternoon and sent Richard on the 3rd day for the parish surgeon, a man named Stephen Hawkes, who kept his house and his practice in Newport, 3 miles off across the fields. Hawkes came on horseback that same afternoon. He climbed the ladder to the loft, ducked his head under the beam, and sat on the edge of the boy's mattress with a leather bag between his boots. He took the pulse. He looked at the tongue, which he later wrote was foul and yellowed at the root. He pressed the belly and the boy cried out. He asked what the boy had eaten in the last 2 days, and Sarah told him, in a level voice, that Joseph had eaten what the family had eaten, a bit of bacon on Sunday, a plate of boiled potato on Monday, and on the morning of the first sickness, a bowl of rice, sweetened with a spoon of dark sugar, and set out on the hearth to cool. The surgeon nodded and closed his bag, and told her to keep the boy warm, and to give him only barley water and a little sugar. He would return, he said, in the morning. Joseph was dead before morning. I have to stop the story here for a heartbeat and tell you the truth, as it stood in that cottage on that night, because otherwise the horror of what is coming will lose its proper weight. A 10-year-old boy dying in an Essex loft in January 1845 was not, in itself, an event that would move a parish. Children died in the country in those years, the way lambs died in the fold, and for the same reason, the world was hard, and the medicine was rough, and the winters were long. Half the mothers in Clavering had buried at least one child before its 10th birthday. The vicar had a form of words for the burial of a child, and he had used the form of words often. Hawkes rode home that morning across the frost, and thought perhaps of some mischief eaten in a hedge, some bad meat, some low fever taking off a strong boy who might have shaken it in another season. He did not write a note. He did not send for the coroner. He drank his tea by his own fire, and he sighed, and he set the visit down in his ledger as one of the ordinary sadnesses of a country practice. James took ill in the last week of the same month. He was Joseph's brother. He was 2 years younger, a slighter boy, with the same brown hair. He had followed his brother's coffin to the churchyard behind the pony cart, holding his mother's hand, and he had eaten his supper afterwards without much appetite, and he had gone to bed in the loft, where the older brother was no longer there, and lain awake for a long time in the dark. He fell ill on the 12th day after that supper. He too complained first of the stomach. He too could not keep down the water his mother brought him. He too spoke of a burning in the throat. And the parish surgeon, called for the second time to that same low loft, climbed the same ladder with the same bag, and sat on the edge of the same mattress, and looked into the face of a second boy who was going the way the first one had gone. You do not sit twice in the same loft in the same month without beginning to think. Hawkes was not a suspicious man by nature. He had practised in that part of Essex for the best part of 20 years, and he was known in the tap-room of the Cock and in the vestry of the church as a level-headed, sober person who took his fees when he could and forgave them when he could not. He did not go up any ladder looking for a crime, but he was also not a man who could see, in the space of 13 days, 2 brothers taken down in the same manner by the same complaint in the same room, and go home and write nothing. On the evening of the second visit, after James had slipped into the same sleep from which his brother had not woken, Hawkes sat down at his own kitchen table in Newport with a candle at his elbow, and he wrote out for himself the symptoms he had seen. He wrote the vomit. He wrote the burning throat. He wrote the sudden cold sweat and the pinched face and the rapid weak pulse. In the margin, in a hand that grew a little tighter as it went, he added 3 words that had not been in his book before that week: irritant, mineral, arsenic. He did not, that night, cross the fields to the constable. A country surgeon in 1845 did not go to law on a suspicion. He did not have the training to be certain, and he knew it, and the tests for arsenic in a stomach were things done in the laboratories of London hospitals, not in a rented back room in Newport. What Hawkes did do, in the fortnight that followed the death of James, was talk. He talked to the coroner over a glass of sherry at the county town. He talked to the incumbent at Clavering after a meeting of the Poor Law Guardians. He talked to another surgeon at Bishop Stortford, who had trained beside him at Guy's Hospital in London 20 years before. He told each of them, in the same guarded phrasing, what he had seen. He named the household. He named the mother. He did not, in any of these conversations, use a word so hard as accusation. He used the word disquiet, and the word doubt, and the word inquiry. The word ran, as such words do in a county town, out from those conversations and into the parlours around them, and from the parlours into the servants' halls, and from the servants' halls, at last, into the lanes. The record does not tell us the hour at which the first cottage in Clavering heard the word from Newport. It may have come with a carter delivering coal at the churchyard gate. It may have come with a maid walking home to her mother for a Sunday afternoon. It may have come with a shopkeeper writing an order at his own counter. What the record does tell us, plainly, is that by the spring of 1845, the parish of Clavering knew that the surgeon had wondered aloud, more than once, whether the 2 Chesham boys had died of a natural cause. Once a parish begins to wonder such a thing, the wondering does not stop. You have to picture how a piece of news of that shape moves through an English village in that decade. It does not move by print. There is no newspaper in Clavering, and if there were, no cottager would take it. It moves by mouth. It moves at the churchyard gate after a service, in the pause when the vicar has gone in and the parishioners linger on the path before setting off home. It moves at the well behind the cock, where the women fetch water in the morning and stand a moment with the yoke on their shoulders. It moves in the taproom at the far end of the day, when the labourers are down to the last of their beer and their voices have grown lower and more measured. The news, in every one of these places, always ran along the same line. The two boys died in January. The surgeon has said what the surgeon has said. And the mother who nursed them still keeps her cottage, and still bakes her bread, and still walks up to the church on Sunday with her cap pulled straight. I want to be honest with you here about what we do not know. We do not know whether Sarah Chesham grieved for her sons in the way another mother would. Some of the neighbours, in later years, when a great deal of dark ink had been spilled over her, said that she had not shed a tear at either graveside. Others said that she had wept until the vicar himself was moved to lay a hand on her shoulder. The two accounts cannot both be right, and I do not know which was the lie. It is easier to remember a woman crying if you have decided in advance that she is innocent, and easier to remember dry eyes if you have decided in advance that she is guilty. Memory in a parish, in the years after a scandal, has a way of arranging itself around the verdict. Both accounts were given by people who were certain, and both, in the end, tell us more about the parish than about Sarah. We have to leave the cottage for a moment and go to the churchyard, because the churchyard is where the parish went to look for its own answer that spring. The two graves stood together in the corner where the wall meets the yew, and the sexton had cut a single flat stone for the two of them, with the names and the dates and one short line beneath, taken in the January of this year. Neighbours who had crossed the churchyard on any other errand began to make a short detour on their way home, to stand a moment by that stone. They did not speak, most of them. They read the names. They looked back across the wall toward the roof of the Chesham cottage in the distance, black thatched among the elms. They made whatever reckoning they made in their own heads, and then they went back to their own doors. Not one of them, that spring, went to the constable. This is worth pausing on, because it says something about the mood of the village that a modern ear will miss. A parish of that size and that class did not carry a suspicion to the law lightly. To fetch the constable to a neighbour's door was to break a hedge that was rarely mended. It cost a friendship. It cost a working relationship in the harvest field. It cost, in some cases, a whole family's standing at the churchyard gate. And so the parish did what parishes of that period habitually did, with a suspicion of this weight. It watched. It counted. It waited to see what the mother would do next. Sarah did nothing that could be counted against her. She kept her hearth. She kept her floor scrubbed to the same brick shine. She baked her bread on the Tuesday and the Friday, and she carried the loaves in on the peel and stood them on the dresser to cool. She fed the pig. She drew water at the well behind the door. She sat with Richard by the fire in the evening, and she rose before him in the morning, and she went in and out of the parish shop in Newport when her flour was low, and she bought what she needed at the counter and paid what she owed. In April she planted the beans in the garden, in the neat rows the previous tenant had laid out, and the beans came up, as beans always do on the Essex clay, in a green rush that took the eye. I have stood at the wall of that churchyard, in the autumn of a much later year, and looked back toward where the cottage once stood, and it is very ordinary ground. The cottage is gone. A row of newer houses stands roughly on its line. The elms are gone too, taken by disease a lifetime ago. What is left, if you go and look, is the yew and the corner of the wall, and the flat stone with the two names on it, which the weather has worn thin but not away. It is a modest stone. It looks like any other stone at the edge of an English churchyard, and if you did not know the story you would walk past it without a pause, as people walk past it every Sunday now. By the end of that summer the word had begun to move outward, from Clavering into the neighbouring parishes. A drover at a hiring fair in Newport mentioned the Chesham household to a farmer from a village 4 miles off, and the farmer took the word home with him. A servant girl carried it to a household at Ugly. A carter set it down at the door of a public house at Manewden. It did not yet take the shape of a nickname. It did not yet name her in a single word. It was still, in the summer of 1845, a long murmur of 2 boys and a bowl of rice, and a surgeon who had gone home in the frost and written arsenic in the margin of his book. The murmur was travelling. In the tap rooms it was, week by week, growing shorter. What had begun as a whole sentence about a household and a surgeon and a January was folding down, in the mouths of the men who repeated it, into fewer and fewer words. And a name that had never been given at any font, that no vicar had ever entered in any register, was beginning to gather in the throats of the drinkers at the Cock and at the Coach and Horses, waiting for a night when someone, tired enough and drunk enough and cruel enough, would say it out loud. The whisper of Sally Arsenic. It came out at last on a wet night in the November of 1845, in the low back room of the Coach and Horses at Newport, where the labourers went after the last of the day's work, and the door stayed open into the passage for the smoke to draw. A drover from a village toward the county boundary had ridden in that afternoon with a string of ewes for the market, and he had drunk 2 pints of the landlord's beer, and he was on his 3rd, and he was telling a story he had told at every stopping place between his own parish and this one. He was telling about the 2 boys at Clavering, and the surgeon riding home in the frost, and the bowl of rice on the hearth. And when he came to the end of it, and set his mug down on the deal table and wiped his mouth on the back of his sleeve, another man at the same table, an older labourer with a hare lip and a slow way of speaking, leaned forward on his elbow and said one thing into the silence that followed. "Sally Arsenic," he said. "That is her name now." The room did not laugh. A country tap room in that decade knew the weight of a nickname given to a woman still living, and it did not give one lightly. What the room did was fall quiet for a heartbeat, and then take up its own low talk again, and each man there carried the 2 words home in his head that night as he walked back along the lane. And by the next market day at Newport, the 2 words were in a dozen mouths, and by Christmas they were in every mouth for 5 miles round. You have to understand how a nickname of that kind travels in an English parish in the 1840s, because the travelling of it matters as much as the word itself. It does not travel by any single tongue. It travels because the shape of it fits into a certain kind of pause. A carter, meeting another carter at a crossroads, pulls up his horse, and the 2 of them talk for a moment about the weather and the state of the road, and then one of them says, "And did you hear, over at Clavering, they are calling her Sally Arsenic now," and the second carter clicks his tongue and shakes his head and rides on, and at the next inn he sets it down in the same words to the ostler, and the ostler takes it into the tap and lays it down among the men at the fire, and by nightfall it has moved another mile. There is no malice in most of the mouths that carry it. There is only the small pleasure a poor and tired and cold man takes, in a hard winter, in knowing a thing his neighbour has not yet heard. I want to stop here and say a plain thing about the nickname itself, because it matters. Sarah Chesham had not, at that hour of her life, been charged with any crime. She had not stood in any dock. No coroner had opened her boys, and no chemist in London had tested any tissue from them, and no jury of any kind had heard any word of evidence against her. What the parish had was a surgeon's private disquiet, spoken in a few careful conversations, and repeated afterwards by servants and shopkeepers and the wives of the church-going farmers, and out of that thin material the Lanes had made a name and hung it round her neck. The record does not tell us who first spoke the 2 words in the Coach and Horses. The name I gave a moment ago, the older labourer with the hare lip, is the name a later local writer set down on the strength of an old man's memory, and I would not swear to it. What is beyond argument is that the words were in the air by the winter of 1845, and that they stayed there for the rest of her life. Sarah herself, in the cottage at Clavering, did not, for some weeks, know the words had been spoken at all. Richard Chesham heard them first, in the way a husband in a small parish tends to hear such things. He had walked into the tap of the Cock at Clavering on a Saturday evening for a mug of beer, as he had walked in on 100 Saturday evenings before, and he had noticed, at the door, that the conversation at the far end of the room dropped a note when he came in. He had noticed the two young men by the fire look at him and look away. He had noticed the landlord fill his mug more carefully than usual and set it down with less of a word. He drank his beer in his usual corner and paid his penny and walked home in the dark, and he said nothing about it to his wife when he came in, because in that parish, in that year, a man did not carry such a thing across his own threshold. He heard the actual words a week later, from a farmer he had helped in the harvest, who took him aside at the gate of a field and told him, with real kindness in a rough voice, what the taprooms were saying. The farmer did not say he believed it. He said only that Richard should know, because a man had a right to know what was said behind his back about his own wife. Richard nodded. He thanked the farmer. He walked home along the hedge, and when he came into the cottage he sat down on the settle beside the hearth and looked into the fire for a long time before he spoke, and even then he only asked Sarah for his supper. He did not tell her what he had heard. Not that night. Not, so far as anyone was ever able to find out afterwards, for a good many nights after that. The record does not say what she thought when she at last heard the name for herself. It came to her, as such things always do, in a shop. She had walked into Newport on a market day, with a basket over her arm and a shilling knotted into the corner of her apron, and she had gone into the grocer's, which was the same grocer's from which every wife in the parish bought her flour and her sugar and her twist of blue paper for the rats. She stood at the counter waiting to be served. Two women at the other end of the shop went quiet when they saw her. One of them, a wife from a village nearer to the town, looked at her steadily for the length of a heartbeat, and then leaned into her friend and said something behind her hand, and the friend looked and looked away, and the first woman said, low but not so low that Sarah could not hear, "There she is, Sally Arsenic." And the grocer, who had heard the words too, and who had known Sarah for 19 years, weighed out her pound of flour without meeting her eyes. She paid. She took her basket. She walked out of the shop into the street. She walked home along the same 3 miles of road she had walked all her married life. And she did not, so far as anyone ever recorded, say a word to Richard about it when she came in, any more than he had said a word to her the week before. Two people in one small cottage that winter sat down each night to their supper with the same nickname unspoken between them, and it hung above their table like the black kettle on the crane, and neither of them lifted it down. I have to admit a thing here, because this is the point in the story where the sources begin to disagree in a way that matters. Some of the neighbours, in the years after Sarah's death, said that the nickname changed her. They said she grew silent and short of temper, and that she stopped coming into Newport on a market day and sent Richard instead. They said her cap was less carefully pinned. They said she stopped going up to the church on Sundays, and that when the vicar called at the cottage to ask after her, she would not open the door. Other neighbours, asked the same questions by the same later writers, said the opposite. They said she went on exactly as before. They said she came into Newport every fortnight and stood at the same counter and paid her penny for her twist of blue paper and walked home along the same road with her back straight and never once let anyone see that she had heard a thing. Which of these two Sarahs is the truer one, I cannot tell you. Both were remembered by people who had known her. Neither, I suspect, is quite the woman who was really there. What is certain is that from the winter of 1845 onward, she was no longer, in the mouths of her parish, only Sarah Chesham. There were two of her now. There was the wife at the cottage who baked her bread on the Tuesday and the Friday. And there was the other, in the taprooms, who had a shorter name and a colder one. The nickname did what nicknames of that shape always do. It hardened. In its first weeks it had been spoken with a kind of half-laugh, the way a country parish speaks a joke about a neighbour it does not yet quite believe. By the spring of 1846 it had lost the laugh. It had settled into the plain register of a fact. Men in the taproom no longer said, "They are calling her Sally Arsenic now." They said, "Sally Arsenic was in the shop today." They said, "Sally Arsenic's boy was seen at the gate." The name had moved, in the mouths of the parish, from a thing said about her to a thing said instead of her. It was, by any measure a plain reader would recognise, a verdict passed by the lanes long before any court had been asked for one. We have to walk out of the tap-room for a moment and back to the churchyard, because the churchyard was where the parish went on measuring her. The two graves in the corner where the wall meets the yew had, by that spring, been joined by a small iron marker set into the ground by some hand that no one would afterwards claim. It was only a plain iron rod bent into a loop at the top, of the kind a blacksmith would make in an idle hour for the price of a pint. But it stood at the head of the boys' shared stone, and it was there for years, and no one ever removed it, and no one ever asked in the vestry who had put it there. It was, in its small way, the parish's own private headstone for what it had decided about their mother, and it stood behind her back for the rest of her life, out at the edge of the churchyard, quiet as iron always is. Richard, all this time, was growing thinner. This is a thing the neighbours agreed on afterwards, and the record backs them on it, because the parish surgeon in Newport saw him more than once across those months, and noted a wasting in the frame he had known for years as a stout, plain-built countryman. What was wrong with Richard in the spring and summer of 1846, no one at the time set down. He himself said only that his stomach was not what it had been. Sarah said, when asked at the church gate, that he was eating what she put before him, and that she could not think what more a wife could do. The surgeon prescribed a tonic of bark and sherry, which Richard took, and which did him no good. He rose in the morning slower than he had risen the year before. He ate less at his supper. He fell asleep in his chair by the hearth at 8 in the evening, and Sarah moved about the cottage around him without waking him, and drew the shutter, and banked the fire, and climbed the ladder to the loft, and lay down alone in a bed that had once held 4. You must, at this hour of the story, hold 2 pictures of that cottage in your mind at once. There is the picture from the lane, where the parish now walked past the door, with its head half turned, and where the 2 words Sally Arsenic ran ahead of Sarah every time she stepped outside her own gate. And there is the picture inside the cottage, which was, by every honest account, still the picture of an ordinary Essex household in the middle of a hard year. Bread on the dresser, ash on the hearth, a husband coughing in a chair, a wife stirring a pot. The 2 pictures were both true. The distance between them is where the whole horror of what was coming would eventually lie. Word from the tap-rooms had, by the late summer of 1846, reached the offices where such words begin to matter. The parish surgeon at Newport, that same steady man who had ridden out to the loft in January 1845, had, by then, spoken more than once to the coroner for the northern division of Essex, and the coroner had listened, and had made his own quiet notes, and had, at last, written a letter to a magistrate at the county town whose name is preserved in the records of the Assizes. In the letter, the coroner did not use the nickname the tap-rooms had given her. He used only her own name, and the names of her boys, and the date of the January burial. But the letter was there, in the magistrate's tray, from the September of that year, and the machinery it started was slow to turn but very hard to stop. The parish went on into its own winter. The wind moved over the thatch at the Chesham cottage, as it had moved for 20 years. Richard sat by the hearth with a blanket across his knees. Sarah went in and out with her basket. The frost came and hardened the ruts in the lane, and a coach along the London road, one grey afternoon in the last week of the year, carried a folded warrant and an under-sheriff toward the town of Chelmsford, and the assize calendar for the following March, which was still being drawn up by a clerk in a chilly room above the county jail, was about to have her name written into it, in a careful copperplate hand, under the heading of the second day's business. The Chelmsford Assizes. The under-sheriff's coach came into Chelmsford on the last day of February, in the year 1847, along the London road with its wheels stiff from a hard frost, and the town received him without much fuss, because a coach carrying a warrant in the week before an assize was a sight the ostlers of the George had seen many times before. He took a room at that inn. He handed the folded paper across the desk in the county gaol above the yard. He drank a glass of hot rum by the fire, and he went to his bed, and in the morning he rode back out along the same road he had come in by, and his part in the business was done. The paper stayed. It sat on the deputy governor's desk for a night and a day, and on the second morning a constable in a heavy coat set out from the jail at Chelmsford with the paper in his pocket, on a horse borrowed from the ostler, bound for the cottage at Clavering, that lay 18 miles off across the winter fields. He came to the door in the early afternoon. Sarah was baking. The record does not tell us what she said when she opened the door and saw the constable at the step, and it does not tell us whether Richard was in the cottage at that hour or out at the field, and I would not care to guess. What is set down in the constable's own hand is that she asked for a moment to bank her fire, and that she asked for a moment to change her apron, and that he waited for her at the gate while she did both. She rode with him back into Newport that afternoon on the pillion of his horse, with a cloth bundle of her own things at her hip, and by the following morning she had been taken on into Chelmsford, and by the evening of the 2nd of March she was inside the county jail, in a whitewashed cell that looked out through an iron grille onto the yard where the coach had come in a week before. We have to leave her there for a moment, in that cell, and cross the town to the room where her name had, by then, already been written into a list. The Assize Hall at Chelmsford in that decade stood at the top of the High Street, a heavy building of Portland stone with tall windows and a broad step, and the second day's calendar for the Lent Assize had been posted on a board at the door for a fortnight. Her name was on it, low down on the sheet, in a copperplate hand that a clerk in the room above the gale had drawn out on a raw evening in January by the light of 2 candles. The charge was set beside the name in the shorter style the courts kept for such things. Wilful murder. 2 counts, one for the boy Joseph and one for the boy James. A third charge had been added at the bottom, in a later ink and in a hurried hand, for the attempted poisoning of a labourer's child at a neighbouring parish, whose mother, in the weeks after the constable's visit, had come forward with a tale of her own. The 3 charges together made a longer sheet than most of the names on the board, and travellers passing through the market that week paused at the door and read the list and pointed and moved on. The trial opened on the 11th of March. Sarah, the wife from the cottage at Clavering, who half the county now knew only by a nickname from the tap rooms, was brought up from the cell by a warder in a leather coat, along a low passage that ran under the yard, and she came into the dock by a short flight of stone steps that rose out of the floor of the court itself. The record says she wore a gown of dark stuff and a bonnet without any ribbon, and that she looked at the judge for a moment when she reached the top of the steps, and then looked down at her own hands on the rail in front of her, and that she did not, for the whole of the 2 days that followed, weep once. She was a woman by then in her middle years, worn by 20 winters on the Essex clay, and the court reporters who wrote afterwards for the London papers all said, in slightly different words, the same thing. She looked older than her years. She looked tired. She looked, one of them wrote, like a woman who had come into the court from a very long walk. The counsel for the Crown rose first. He was a Chelmsford man by training, and he had prepared his opening with care, because the case had been sent up to the Assize with a great deal of talk behind it, and very little paper. He set out for the jury the 2 deaths in the loft at Clavering in the January of 1845. He set out the visits of the parish surgeon at Newport, Stephen Hawkes, and the surgeon's private notes, and the word arsenic in the margin of the book. He set out the 3rd charge, of the labourer's child at the neighbouring parish, and the mother's account of a spoonful of gruel that had come from Sarah's hand. And then, having laid the 3 charges before the 12 men in the box, he began to call his witnesses, and the case of the Crown began, from that hour onward, to come apart in his hands. Hawkes was the first man called. He climbed into the box, and he took the oath, and he told the court what he had told the coroner and the magistrate before. He described the loft. He described the 2 boys. He described the burning throat, and the vomit, and the sudden cold sweat. And then he was asked, by the counsel for the defence, whether he had, at the time of either death, ordered any test of the stomach for arsenic. He had not. He was asked whether he had, at the time of either death, sent for the coroner. He had not. He was asked whether he could, standing in that court that morning, swear on his oath that either boy had died of arsenic and not of some low fever of the season. He paused for a moment before he answered. He said honestly that he could not. He stepped down from the box a paler man than he had climbed into it, and the counsel for the Crown, watching from his bench, did not, in his notes for that day, write anything at all beside the surgeon's name. I have to stop here for a heartbeat, because this is the point at which the whole shape of the trial began to bend, and it is worth understanding why. Sarah Chesham was standing in the dock at Chelmsford on the thinnest kind of evidence a court of that period could weigh. There was no chemist's test from any laboratory. There was no white powder in any twist of paper found in her cottage by any constable. There was, at the heart of the case, only a country surgeon's memory of 2 boys in a loft, and the word arsenic he had written in the margin of his own book by the light of his own candle. Everything else the Crown had to offer was talk. It was the talk of the tap rooms, and the talk at the well, and the talk at the churchyard gate, and none of it was the kind of talk that a judge would admit as evidence. The neighbours came next. They came reluctantly. This is a thing that shows in the reporter's notes for the 2 days of the trial. A carter from Clavering, called to speak about a conversation he had heard at the Cock, stood in the box with his cap in his hand and gave his answers in single words, and could not, when pressed, name the man who had spoken. A wife from Newport, called to describe the scene at the grocer's counter in the winter of 1845, said she could not now be sure which of 2 women had spoken the nickname, and she could not be sure Sarah had heard it, and she was sorry, and she stepped down. A labourer from the parish where the 3rd charge had been laid gave a long, tangled answer about a bowl of gruel and a child and a Sunday afternoon, and by the end of it the jury was looking at him with the honest unease of 12 men who did not know what he was trying to say. 2 witnesses, called in the afternoon, did not appear at all. One of them was said, by the officer who had gone to fetch him, to have gone into Suffolk for the week on a matter of a horse. The other was said to be ill. Neither of these excuses convinced the court. Neither, in truth, was meant to. It was the honest view of the reporters that a certain number of the people who might have spoken hardest against Sarah Chesham had, in the fortnight before the assize, made themselves quietly unfindable, in the way a country parish can make its own witnesses vanish when it decides, in some corner of its mind, that a matter has gone far enough. The mother of the labourer's child took the box on the 2nd day. She was a young woman, perhaps 23 or 24, with a thin face and a very direct way of looking at whoever spoke to her. She gave her account without ornament. She had been ill after a childbirth, and Sarah, whom she had known for some years, had come to her cottage with a bowl of gruel, and her infant had, in the hours after taking a spoonful of it, been very sick. That was the whole of what she had come to say. Under cross-examination, she agreed that the infant had lived. She agreed that she herself had eaten from the same bowl, and had not been ill. She agreed that she could not swear the gruel had contained anything at all except oats and water. And when the counsel for the defence asked her, at the very end, why she had waited nearly 2 years before coming forward with her tale, she said only that she had not liked to. Then she stepped down, and she left the court by a side door, and she is not, so far as the record shows, ever heard from again. The judge summed up on the afternoon of the 2nd day. He was a careful man, from all we know of him, and he did his duty by the case as he found it. He reminded the jury that talk in a tap-room was not evidence. He reminded them that a surgeon's private disquiet, however honest, could not stand in for a chemist's test. He reminded them, in words that the reporters set down almost identically, that a jury in an English court must convict on proof and not on suspicion, however loud the suspicion had grown in the lanes of a parish. The jury retired at 4 o'clock. They were back in the box in less than an hour. Not guilty, on all 3 counts. Sarah was in the dock when the words were read. She lifted her head at the first of them and looked, this time, not at the judge but at the foreman of the jury, and the foreman, the reporters said, could not meet her eye. She was told she was free to leave the court. She stepped down from the dock by the same short flight of stone steps she had come up 2 days before. She was taken back along the passage under the yard to collect her cloth bundle from the cell, and then she was walked out through the door onto the high street of Chelmsford in the grey light of a March afternoon, a free woman, with the 18 miles of road between her and her own cottage still to go. She travelled home the next morning. Richard had sent no message, and no cart had come for her, and she had no money in her pocket for the coach. She walked. This is a thing the record is firm about, and it is worth stopping on for a moment, because it is a hard thing to imagine, and a harder one to forget. A woman in the middle years of her life, worn by 20 winters, walked 18 miles alone along the London road in the March of 1847, with her cloth bundle over her shoulder and a verdict at her back that half the county already refused to believe. She stopped, we are told, at an inn at Widford for a mug of small beer and a slice of bread, and the landlord served her without a word. She stopped again at Bishop Stortford for a rest by a milestone, and a farmer passing in a cart offered her a lift for the last 5 miles, and she took it, and she sat up on the boards beside him and answered his questions in half-sentences, and he set her down at last at the head of the lane at Clavering as the light was going out of the sky. She walked the last half-mile alone. The parish, as she came along it, did not come out to meet her. No one had lit a lamp for her at any window. No child ran ahead along the hedge. She came to her own gate in the near dark, and she pushed it open with her free hand, and she walked up the path to her own door, and Richard, who had heard the latch, was standing in the passage with a rushlight in his hand. The record does not say what they said to each other in that first moment. I have wondered about it for a long time, and I do not think I would want to guess. What is certain is that the door closed behind her, and the light in the passage went out, and the cottage at Clavering held the two of them again, for the first time in a fortnight, and for the last few years either of them was going to have. Outside, along the lane, a curtain moved at one window, and then at another, and then at a third. The parish had counted her out to Chelmsford, and it had counted her back. It had heard the verdict from a carter on the coach that afternoon, and it had, within the hour, decided what it thought of the verdict. And by the time the last curtain fell back into place along that lane, and the last candle in the last window blew itself out for the night, the nickname the taprooms had given her 2 winters before had, in every mouth for 5 miles round, hardened into something the law had, in its own way, only just refused to touch. A cottage under watch. The lane at Clavering, in the spring of 1847, was the same lane it had been for 200 years. The hedges came into leaf in the 3rd week of April. The blackthorn along the ditch went white and then went green. A cart track ran from the London road down past the Cock and along the churchyard wall and out toward the fields, and it was walked, morning and evening, by the same 40 or 50 labourers and their wives who had walked it before Sarah Chesham ever came home from the Assizes. What had changed was not the lane. What had changed was the way the lane held her. I want to walk down that path with you for a moment, because the whole shape of this chapter lives in the walking of it. A wife in an Essex parish in that decade did not stay indoors. She went out. She went out to the well twice a day, with a wooden yoke across her shoulders, and a pail at each end of it. She went out to the churchyard on a Sunday. She went out to the shop at Newport on a market day for her flour and her sugar and her twist of blue paper. She went out to a neighbour's cottage to help with a lying in or a laying out, or the plucking of a goose for a christening. The lane was where a labouring wife lived a great deal of her life. And in the months after Sarah came home from Chelmsford, the lane began, very steadily, to empty around her. It did not empty all at once. This is one of the things the parish afterwards remembered, and the memory is worth trusting on, because it is the kind of detail no one invents. In the first week of her return, the lane went on more or less as before. A woman she had known for 15 years called at the gate with a basket of eggs and a message from the vicar's wife. A neighbour asked her, over the hedge, how Richard was doing. A boy from a farm at the top of the parish nodded at her when she passed him on the road. The parish, in that first week, was still working out what to do with a verdict it did not agree with. It had not yet made up its mind. By the end of April it had. The record does not say who was first to cross the road, and I would not care to guess. What is set down, in later accounts by neighbours who spoke to the writer from the county paper 20 years afterwards, is that by the week after Easter, no wife in Clavering would meet her at the well. Sarah would come down the path with her yoke and her 2 pails, and the 2 or 3 women already at the stone would finish their drawing without a word to her, and would take up their yokes and walk back along the lane, and Sarah would draw her water alone. She learned, within a fortnight, to come to the well at hours when no one else was likely to be there. Very early, before the first cock crowed in the yard of the cock. Very late, after the last supper fire had been banked at the last cottage. The water she drew at those hours was the same water anyone else drew. It only tasted, we may suppose, a little colder. The churchyard went the same way, and it went faster. On the Sunday after her return, she walked up the lane with Richard on her arm, and they came into the porch a few minutes before the service began, and they took the pew they had taken for 19 years, on the north side of the nave under the second window. The pew in front of them stayed empty. The pew behind them stayed empty. A family who had sat behind the Cheshams every Sunday since the year the church was re-roofed took, that morning, a bench at the very back of the nave, and would not, for the rest of Sarah's life, ever sit within 20 feet of her again. She did not come back to the church after that Sunday. Some later accounts said the vicar had asked her, at the porch, not to come. Others said he had said nothing, and that Sarah had made up her own mind at the door. The record does not settle it. What is certain is that from that April onward, on a Sunday morning, the Chesham pew stood empty, and Richard went to church alone. We have to leave the lane and the churchyard for a moment, and step into the cottage itself, because a change was already at work there that the parish had not yet seen. Richard Chesham, who had come home from the Assizes a thin man, was, by the summer of 1847, thinner still. He had lost, by his own reckoning to the parish surgeon, a stone in weight since the year before. His coat hung off him. His belt had 2 new holes punched into it, and the second of them was 3 inches inside the old mark. His hands, which had always been broad and calloused, had a look about them now that the surgeon, in a private note, called the look of a hand that is not doing enough work to keep itself warm. Hawkes had come out to the cottage in the June of that year, at Richard's own asking, and had sat with him for an hour by the hearth. He had listened to his chest. He had felt along his belly. He had asked him what he was eating, and Richard had told him, honestly, that his wife put food in front of him 3 times a day, and that he ate what was put there, and that he could not think what more a man could do. Hawkes had prescribed the same tonic of bark and sherry he had prescribed the year before. He had ridden home along the lane afterwards without stopping at the Cock for his usual mug of beer. And in the note he wrote up that night, which survives in the parish papers, he set down 2 sentences that I will read to you as he wrote them, because they are the honest voice of a country surgeon in a hard place. "Cannot say what ails Chesham," he wrote. "Cannot say I would eat at that hearth if I were him. I have to be careful how I say the next thing, because the truth of it matters." Hawkes did not, in that note, accuse Sarah of poisoning her husband. He did not, on any occasion in the summer or the autumn of 1847, go to the coroner or the magistrate with any such charge. He was a plain man, and he had watched a Crown case built on his own private disquiet come apart at Chelmsford, and he had, so far as we can tell, decided that he would not, a second time, be the reason a woman stood in a dock, unless he had something firmer than a note in a margin to put before her. So he wrote his 2 sentences, and he shut his book, and he went on riding out to the cottage every 6 or 8 weeks through that summer, and he did what a country surgeon in that decade could do, which was very little. The parish, meanwhile, had begun to watch the cottage in a way I want you to picture clearly. It was not a watch by any officer of the law. No constable stood at the gate. No magistrate had ordered any observation. The watching was done by the ordinary eyes of the lane. A carter passing in the morning would slow his horse a little at the Chesham gate, and would look up the path, and would look at the window, and would carry the shape of what he had seen to the next inn he came to. A neighbour hanging out linen in the yard next door would take longer than usual over the pegs on the line nearest the Chesham hedge. A boy sent up the lane on an errand would report, on his return, what he had noticed at the door. Nothing formal, nothing on paper. But by the September of that year the parish knew, more or less, at what hour Richard rose in the morning, and at what hour the fire went out at the cottage at night, and on which mornings the shutter did not open at all. The wife herself. What was Sarah doing that summer inside her own house? This is a question the record answers only in glimpses, and the glimpses do not agree. Some of the parish, asked afterwards, said she moved about the cottage as she had always moved. She baked her bread on the Tuesday and the Friday. She salted her bacon in the autumn. She stitched a shirt for Richard by the hearth in the evening. She kept, in every outward sign, the house of a plain Essex wife. Others said she had stopped. They said the bread went unbaked for a fortnight at a time. They said Richard was seen coming out of the cottage with a heel of stale loaf in his hand and eating it under the hedge in the yard, as if he did not want to eat it at his own table. They said the fire was often out at midday. Which of these Sarahs is the truer one, I cannot tell you. Both were remembered by people who claim to have seen them, and both are set down in the record, and the record does not decide between them. I suspect the truth was that both were partly right, on different days, in different weeks, as any long summer under a hard weight is partly one thing and partly another. The nickname by then had passed a further boundary. It had come out of the tap rooms and into the shops, and now it was coming into the mouths of children. This is a thing 3 separate accounts remember. A boy would call it up the lane at another boy as an insult. A girl at a well would say it under her breath at another girl. A schoolmistress at a village 2 miles off, whose name is not set down, was said to have caught 2 of her scholars trading the 2 words in a whisper at the back of the classroom, and to have hushed them, and then, when she was alone, to have written in her own private book that a name a parish gives a woman is a hard thing to lift once it has been given. The book, if it existed, has not survived. The story of it comes from her niece, who told a local writer 40 years afterwards, and I would not swear to the exact words. What is certain is that by the end of 1847, the name Sally Arsenic was in every mouth in that corner of Essex, and it had, by then, no laugh left in it at all. I want to stop here for one honest thing, because it matters. Nothing in the record of that year proves that Sarah was, at that hour, poisoning her husband. Nothing. The parish believed she was. The lane believed she was. The tap room at the Cock believed she was. But belief in a lane is not the same as a chemist's test in a laboratory, and it is not the same as a coroner's finding, and it is not the same as a stomach opened on a slab, and none of those things had, yet, been done. If you had walked into the cottage at Clavering in the September of that year, and asked me, standing in the passage, what was killing Richard Chesham, I could not have told you. I still cannot tell you, in the honest sense, until the winter comes. What the parish knew, and what the parish could see, was that a man who had been stout at Christmas 1845 was, by the harvest of 1847, a man who could no longer swing a scythe for a whole morning. He rested against the hedge in the middle of a strip. He walked home along the lane in the middle of the day. He sat in his chair by the hearth in the long light of a September afternoon, and did not, when Sarah spoke to him, always answer at once. His hair, which had been a plain brown, was going the ash colour of a man 20 years older. His skin had a look about it that was not quite the yellow of jaundice, and not quite the grey of a cold, but something between the two, as if the light inside him were going down a wick. You do not need a diagnosis to be afraid of a thing like that. The parish did not have one, and the parish was afraid. It was afraid in a way that showed in the emptying of the lane and the emptying of the pew and the emptying of the seat beside her at the well. It was afraid in a way that showed in the private note the surgeon wrote by his own candle. It was afraid in a way that showed in the mouths of the children at the school 2 miles off. And under all of it, the plain fact was this. A husband was thinning in a cottage. A wife was moving about him at the hearth. The shelf above the door still held its ordinary things. And no one, in that whole parish, was going to knock at that gate and ask what was in the pot. We have to close on that. On a cottage under watch, and a lane that had gone half empty, and a churchyard where the pew stood empty on a Sunday, and a fire that was often out by midday, and a man growing thinner in a chair by that fire. The year turned. The blackthorn went to slow along the ditch. The first frosts came in from the flats of the Cam. And Richard Chesham, in his chair by the hearth, drew his blanket a little higher around his shoulders each evening as the light went out of the window, and Sarah went about the cottage around him as she had gone about it for 19 years, and the winter of 1850 was already, somewhere far off along the lane, walking toward them with a slow and unhurried step. The long winter of Richard. The winter came, in the end, without any of the ceremony a village might have wanted for it. There was no great storm along the London road, no drift of snow across the churchyard wall, no bell rung for a cold that had killed a sheep. It came in a plain way, as most winters in Essex come, on a raw wind out of the northeast that carried the salt of the estuary in it, and by the second week of November 1850, the puddles in the cart track down past the Chesham Gate had begun to hold their ice into the middle of the day. I want you to see the cottage as that year turned, because the whole of what follows lives inside the 4 walls of it, and unless you can hold that low room in your head, you cannot understand what a country surgeon walked into. The cottage stood side on to the lane, with its long thatched roof coming down almost to the tops of the windows on the north face. There were 3 rooms on the ground floor, all of them low, and a loft under the ridge that had, 5 winters before, held the 2 boys and their straw pallets. The kitchen was the largest of the ground rooms. A hearth at one end, a settle by the hearth, a rough table under the window that looked out onto the yard, a shelf above the door that held, in ordinary order, a stone jar of salt, a wooden box of sugar, a canister of tea from the shop at Newport, and, on the far end where the light was worst, a twist of blue paper of the kind the grocer at Newport wrapped his rat powder in. That shelf had held those same things for 19 years. It held them still, on the November evening the wind first hardened on the pane, and Richard, from his chair by the hearth, did not look up at it, because a shelf a man has walked past for 19 years is a shelf that does not, for its own sake, ask to be looked at. Richard, by then, had not been down the lane for 6 weeks. He had gone as far as the gate at the end of September, in a coat that hung so loose about him that a boy passing on a cart had, without knowing whose gate he was passing, called out to ask an old man if he wanted a lift. Richard had turned, and the boy had seen his face, and the boy had gone red under his cap, and had driven on without another word. That was, so far as any neighbour afterwards remembered, the last time Richard stood at his own gate on his own feet. From the 1st of October onward he kept to the cottage. From the middle of October he kept, for most of the day, to the chair by the hearth, with a wool blanket over his knees, and a second blanket about his shoulders, and a mug of something warm on the settle at his elbow, that Sarah, moving between the hearth and the table, kept full for him from the pot. I want to slow down here, because the pot on the hob is the whole difficulty of this chapter. Every account of the last months of Richard Chesham comes back, in the end, to what was in that pot, and none of the accounts can say. The surgeon, when he came at last, did not lift the lid. The constable, when he came later, did not think to ask. The neighbours, who had by then not been inside the cottage for 3 years, had no way of knowing. There was a pot on the hob. Sarah kept it filled. Richard drank from it. That is the whole of what the record can honestly tell you, and I would rather say so plainly than pretend to more. What can be told, and told firmly, is what was seen at the door by the 2 or 3 people the parish still allowed inside. The first of them was an elderly widow from the next cottage, whose name the register gives as Anne Batson, and who had known Sarah since her wedding day. She had, alone in the parish, kept the courtesy of a knock at the Chesham gate through the whole of the summer, on the ground, she said afterwards, that a Christian woman does not turn her back on a sick man because his wife has been talked of. She came once a week through October and November. She stood inside the passage for a few minutes and asked how Richard was doing, and Sarah, in that passage, gave her the same answer more or less every time. He was tired. He was thinner. He would eat a spoonful of rice, but nothing that had to be chewed. His throat, she said, had begun to burn. That burning of the throat. It came first, by Sarah's own account to the widow Batson, in the last week of October. Richard had swallowed a spoonful of soup at his supper, and had put the spoon down, and had said, in a voice the widow later remembered Sarah repeating almost exactly, that a coal must have got into the pot. He had drunk a mug of small beer to wash the burning down. It had not gone. It had stayed for an hour, and then for 2, and then he had slept, and in the morning it was there again when he woke, along the sides of his tongue and down into his throat, as if the coal had lodged there overnight. He had eaten no more soup that day. He had eaten a spoonful of rice at midday, and a slice of bread with a scrape of dripping in the evening, and he had drunk the small beer. And by the 3rd day the burning was in his belly as well, low down on the left side, and he could not sit for very long in the chair without shifting himself in it. Stephen Hawkes, the parish surgeon at Newport who had signed the boys' certificates 5 winters before, was sent for at last on the 9th of November. He came the same afternoon. He had been sent for by Sarah herself, in a note carried down the lane by a boy from the next farm, and he had put the note in his pocket and had ridden out along the London road within the hour, because a note from that cottage was, by then, a note no country surgeon in that district would leave overnight. He came in at the gate on his horse. He tied the reins at the ring. He came up the path in his heavy coat, with his bag in his hand, and Sarah opened the door to him before he had touched the latch. He sat with Richard for the greater part of an hour. He listened to his chest. He felt along his belly, low on the left side where Richard flinched. He looked at his tongue. He looked at the whites of his eyes. He asked him what he had been eating, and Richard, from the chair, told him about the soup and the rice and the bread, and about the burning in his throat, and about the way the belly ached now when he sat, and about a thirst that came upon him at odd hours of the night. Hawkes wrote a good deal of this down in the book he kept in the inside pocket of his coat. He said very little in the room that anyone afterwards remembered. He came out into the passage before he left. Sarah was there, with her hands in her apron. He said to her, in a voice the widow Batson afterwards said she had heard through the wall, that Richard was very ill. He said that he did not know what ailed him. He said that he would come again in 3 days. He said, and this is the sentence that later mattered, that Richard was to be fed only on what he, Hawkes, would send from Newport that evening, a preparation of arrowroot in milk that would be brought by the same boy who had carried the note. He said that nothing else was to pass Richard's lips until he, Hawkes, came again. Sarah, in the passage, said she understood. Hawkes went out into the yard and untied his horse, and rode back along the lane in the last of the light. The arrowroot came that evening. The boy set the basin on the doorstep and knocked and stepped back. Sarah brought it into the kitchen. She set it on the table by the window. She did not, that night, warm any of it for Richard. She gave him, instead, a cracked earthenware bowl of rice she had cooked in the pot at midday and had kept back on the hob, and she gave him, with it, a mug of the something warm from the same pot. Richard ate what she put in front of him, because a man in a chair by a hearth in November eats what his wife brings him, and does not ask why the arrowroot the surgeon has sent is standing untouched on the table by the window. I have to stop for one honest thing, because it matters here as it mattered in the last chapter. Nothing in the parish papers proves, in a court's sense of the word, what Sarah put into that pot on the hob that November. The bowl of rice on the settle beside Richard was, on its face, a bowl of rice. The mug of warm broth at his elbow was, on its face, a mug of warm broth. Hawkes had not tested either of them. No constable had come into the kitchen with a magistrate's warrant to lift the lid off the pot. Every account that has come down of what was in those vessels comes from after the fact, from the report of the chemist who tested Richard's stomach in the January that followed, and from the confession of a woman under sentence. Standing in the passage of the cottage on the 9th of November, with the arrowroot cooling in its basin on the table, no living soul in that parish could have sworn, on his oath, what was in the pot on the hob. What was clear, only, was that whatever came out of the pot was killing the man in the chair. The burning came into Richard's mouth in the second week of the month. His lips split at the corners. The inside of his cheek, when he ran his tongue along it, felt to him, he told the widow Batson, like a place where a hot spoon had been drawn across it. He could no longer drink the small beer without the burning starting again in his throat. He could no longer eat the bread with the dripping. The rice, he said, was the only thing that would go down without the burning, and even the rice, in the third week, began to sit in his belly like a stone, and to come up again in the deep of the night into a basin Sarah kept, by then, at the side of the bed. Hawkes came again on the 14th of November, and again on the 18th, and again on the 23rd. On each visit he found Richard weaker. On each visit he asked Sarah whether she had given him the arrowroot he had sent, and on each visit Sarah said, without lowering her eyes, that she had. Hawkes noted, in his private book after the visit on the 23rd, that the basin on the table by the window looked to him to hold, within a spoonful, the same quantity of arrowroot he had seen in it 3 days before. He did not, in the passage that afternoon, say anything to Sarah about the basin. He said, instead, that Richard was not likely to see Christmas. He asked her whether she wished the vicar to be sent for. She said she would think on it. He rode home along the lane in a hard rain, and did not, that night, stop at the Cock for his usual mug of beer. Richard did not see Christmas. He lived, in the end, to the 16th of December. His last week of it went by very slowly, in the chair through the day and in the bed at night, and the burning by then had gone out of his throat and out of his mouth and into a low, dull, all-over heat that did not have a place any more. He asked for the rice less often. He drank from the mug less often. He slept, in the last 3 days, more than he was awake. The widow Batson came in on the 15th and sat with him for an hour. She said afterwards that he had known her. She said he had asked, in a rasping voice, whether it had snowed, and she had told him, honestly, that it had not, but that the wind was cold enough that it might. He had nodded, and had closed his eyes, and had not opened them again while she sat there. She went out into the passage before she left, and she found Sarah at the hearth in the kitchen, stirring the pot with the wooden spoon, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her, and then she went out through the passage and along the path and out at the gate, and she did not, in the 12 hours that followed, come back. Richard died on the evening of the 16th, a little after 8 o'clock. Sarah was in the kitchen at the time, by her own account to Hawkes the next morning, and had heard him call out once from the bedroom, in a voice that had no words in it any more, and had gone in, and had found him gone. She had drawn the blanket up over his face. She had walked out into the yard, and had stood at the gate for a moment, in the cold, and had then come back in, and had banked the fire for the night. She had, by her own account, sat by the hearth until the small hours, and had not, that night, sent for anyone. Hawkes came in the morning at first light. Sarah met him at the door. He walked past her without a word, and went into the bedroom, and he stood by the bed for a good while, and he lifted the blanket at last from Richard's face, and he looked at him, and he set the blanket back where it had been. He came out into the kitchen. He stood by the hearth for a moment with his hat in his hand, and he looked once at the shelf above the door, at the stone jar of salt and the wooden box of sugar and the tea canister, and at the twist of blue paper on the far end where the light was worst. He did not speak to Sarah. He went out into the yard and untied his horse and rode away along the lane in the pale grey light of a December morning that had, indeed, at last, begun to snow. He did not turn for Newport. He kept his horse's head along the frozen ruts of the London road toward the town of Chelmsford, 18 miles off, and he did not stop along the whole of that road at any inn. The coroner's room. The road from Clavering to Chelmsford is 18 miles by the way Hawkes went, and in the middle of December, in a year the parish afterwards remembered as the coldest of that decade, it is not a road any country surgeon rides for pleasure. He rode it that morning at a plain walk for the first hour and at a slow trot for the second, because his horse was a good one and he did not want to founder her on the ice in the ruts. The snow that had begun at Clavering did not follow him south. By the time he passed the milestone at Great Baddow, the sky had cleared, and a hard, low sun lay along the fields to his right, and the frost on the hedges was so bright he had to pull the brim of his hat down over his eyes for the last 3 miles into the town. I want to sit with him on that ride for a moment, because a country surgeon in that decade did not carry a decision like his lightly. Stephen Hawkes had signed 2 death certificates in the January of 1845 for the Chesham boys, and had watched a Crown case built partly on his own private disquiet come apart at Chelmsford in the Assizes of 1847, and had ridden home from that trial along this same road with the taste of a public failure in his mouth. He had promised himself, in a note the parish papers still hold, that he would not, a second time, put a woman in a dock unless he had something firmer than a surgeon's misgiving to lay before her. He had now more than a misgiving. He had a shelf above a door with a twist of blue paper on the far end of it, and a basin of arrowroot that had not been touched in 3 days, and a man laid out under a blanket in a low room at Clavering, with the corners of his mouth split. Whether that was enough for a coroner to move on, he did not, on that ride, know. He came into Chelmsford a little after 2 in the afternoon. He stabled his horse at the George, without going in for the meal the ostler offered him, and he walked from there through the market square to the house of the county coroner in Duke Street, and he stood on the step for a moment before he lifted the knocker, because a step is where a man does the last of his thinking before a thing cannot be taken back. The coroner for the Mid-Essex district in that year was a man named William Codd. He was a solicitor by training, a magistrate by long service, and a coroner by appointment, and he was, by every account that survives of him, a careful and unhurried man who did not open an inquest lightly. He had known Hawkes for the greater part of 10 years. He listened to him, that afternoon, for the whole of an hour, across the desk in his front room, with a fire in the grate and a jug of ale on the tray between them that neither of them touched. Hawkes told him about the boys in 1845. He told him about the acquittal at the Assize in 1847. He told him about the shelf above the door, and the basin of arrowroot on the table by the window, and the split at the corners of Richard's mouth, and the burning in his throat, and the pot on the hob that no one had lifted the lid off. He did not, on any of these points, raise his voice. Codd, on his side of the desk, wrote very little down. He asked at the end a single question. He asked whether Hawkes was prepared to swear an information, on his oath, that he had reason to believe Richard Chesham had died from a cause other than natural disease. Hawkes said that he was. Codd closed his book. He stood up. He said he would come out to Clavering himself the following morning. He was as good as his word. On the 18th of December, in a hired chaise from the George, William Codd came up the London road with a clerk beside him and a constable on the box, and he came into Clavering a little before noon, and he did not stop at the Cock. He drove past the churchyard wall and along the cart track and up to the Chesham gate, and he got down at the gate himself and walked up the path in a heavy black coat, and he knocked at the door with the head of his stick. Sarah opened it. This is one of the details the parish afterwards remembered, because the parish had expected her, by then, to run. She did not run. She stood in the doorway in her working apron, with her hands folded in front of it, and she looked at the 3 men on her step, and she said, in a plain voice, that they had better come in. Codd went past her into the passage. The clerk followed him. The constable stayed at the door. They stayed in the cottage for the greater part of 2 hours. What was said between William Codd and Sarah Chesham in her own kitchen, in front of her own hearth, on the 18th of December 1850, the record does not preserve. The clerk sat in the corner, with his book on his knee, and wrote a good deal, but the book, if it survived, is not in the papers that came down to the county archive. What is set down, in Codd's own hand in the inquest file, is the outcome. He viewed the body of Richard Chesham in the bedroom. He noted the corners of the mouth. He noted the colour of the tongue. He noted the weight of the man, which he estimated, by eye, at not much above 7 stone. He came out into the passage, and he told Sarah, in front of the clerk and the constable, that he was that day opening an inquest into the death of her husband, that the body would be removed to the parish room of the church for the sitting of a jury on the following morning, and that a chemist from London would be asked to examine the contents of the stomach. He asked her whether she understood him. She said she did. He asked her whether she had anything to say. She said she had not. He touched his hat to her and went out. I want to stop with you for a moment on that answer, because the honest reading of it is harder than it looks. It has been read by later writers as the calm of guilt. It has been read by others as the numbness of a wife who has just lost a husband. It has been read by a third kind of writer as the flatness of a woman who had, by then, been called Sally Arsenic in every mouth in the parish for 5 winters, and who had, in her own kitchen, run out of any face to make. The record does not decide between these 3 Sarahs. The clerk wrote down what she said. He did not and could not write down why she said it. All I can honestly tell you is that a woman stood in a passage in a cottage at Clavering on that afternoon, and a coroner asked her a question, and she answered it in 3 words, and the 3 men went out. The body of Richard Chesham was carried down the lane that evening on a plain deal board. 4 men from the parish carried it, at the constable's asking, and none of them, by later account, was a man Sarah would have chosen. It was laid in the small parish room at the west end of the church, on trestles, under a sheet, and a lantern was set at the head of it, and the door was locked, and the constable slept that night, at Codd's order, on a straw pallet in the porch. In the morning, at 9 o'clock, the coroner's jury of 12 men from the neighbouring parishes was sworn in the vestry, and the chemist from London, a man by the name of Alfred Swain Taylor, who had by then testified in more poisoning cases than any other man in England, came down on the mail coach and was met at the George at Chelmsford by Codd's clerk, and was brought out to Clavering by the same chaise that had come the day before. Taylor did not, on that visit, examine the body in the parish room. He did not need to. He needed only what was inside it. In a plain leather bag that he carried on his knee in the chaise, he had the small copper apparatus he was known for, which the papers of the day called the Reinsch test, and which needed a slip of clean copper, a flask of hydrochloric acid, and a spirit lamp, and about an hour of a country afternoon, and no more than that. The contents of Richard Chesham's stomach, and portions of his liver and his gut, were removed in the parish room in the presence of 2 of the jurymen, and of Hawkes, and of Taylor himself, and were placed in glass jars stoppered with wax, and were carried by Taylor that same evening back along the London road to Chelmsford, and from there by mail coach to his rooms at Guy's Hospital in London, where the test would be run within a week. The parish, meanwhile, went on with its ordinary Christmas. The bell was rung on the morning of the 25th. The vicar preached on the text of the shepherds in the field. Sarah Chesham was not in the pew. She was not, by then, expected to be. She was in the cottage, alone, with a fire and a pot and a shelf above the door on which the twist of blue paper still lay in its ordinary place. The constable, by Codd's order, walked past the gate twice a day, at first light and at dusk, and did not, on any of those walks in the last week of the year, see her come out. Taylor's report came back to Codd on the 4th of January 1851, in a plain envelope of white paper sealed with red wax, and it was read by Codd in his front room in Duke Street in the same afternoon it was delivered, and it was, in every honest sense, the end of the case as a matter of doubt. Taylor had found arsenic in the stomach of Richard Chesham. He had found arsenic in the liver. He had found arsenic in the gut. He had measured, by his own method, a quantity in the stomach alone that was, in his professional opinion, more than sufficient to have caused death by itself, and he had noted, in a sentence Cod afterwards underlined in ink, that the distribution of the poison through the several organs was consistent with a slow administration over a period of several weeks, rather than a single dose taken at a single meal. That last sentence was the sentence that mattered. A single dose, by that century's reading, could be an accident, a mistake at a jar on a shelf, a rat powder taken up in place of a sugar. A slow administration over several weeks could not. The coroner's jury reconvened at Clavering on the 6th of January. Taylor's report was read aloud in the vestry. Hawkes was called and gave his evidence on his oath. Two neighbours, whose names the file gives as Anne Batson, the widow from the next cottage, and a labourer named John Marsh, who had helped carry the body to the parish room, were called and gave what they had seen. Sarah Chesham was not called. She was not, at that stage of the inquiry, required to be. The jury retired to the far end of the vestry for the greater part of 20 minutes, and came back, and their foreman, a farmer from the parish of Newport, stood up in his ordinary working coat and gave their verdict in one plain sentence: that Richard Chesham had come to his death by the administration of arsenic by some person or persons, that the said person or persons was, in the opinion of the jury, his wife Sarah Chesham. Cod wrote out the warrant that afternoon at the desk in the vestry. The constable took it in his hand and folded it into the inside pocket of his coat and walked up the lane in a hard rain that had begun about noon, and he came to the Chesham gate a little after 4 o'clock. He did not, this time, knock. He lifted the latch and walked up the path and lifted the latch of the cottage door and came into the passage with the warrant in his hand, and he found Sarah in the kitchen at the hearth, with the wooden spoon in the pot on the hob, and a lamp already lit against the early dark of the January afternoon. He read the warrant aloud in the kitchen. She listened to him without moving. When he had finished, he asked her to fetch her cloak. She went into the bedroom and came back with the cloak on her arm, and she put it on in front of the hearth, and she tied it at the throat, and she took down from a peg by the door a plain black bonnet she had worn to church for 19 years, and she tied that as well, and she stood in the passage in front of the constable and asked him if she might bank the fire before she went. He said she might. She went back to the hearth, and she banked the coals with the small brass shovel she kept for the purpose, and she straightened the settle where Richard had sat for the last 3 months of his life, and she came out into the passage and out at the door, and she waited on the step while the constable pulled the door to behind her. They walked down the path in the rain. The chaise from Chelmsford was at the gate. She got in without help. The constable got in beside her. The clerk was on the box beside the driver. The chaise turned in the lane, and it went past the churchyard wall and past the cock at Clavering, where a few faces were in the door of the tap-room, because a chaise was not a common thing in the lane, and it went out along the London road toward Chelmsford in the last of the light. Sarah did not, on that ride, look back at the parish. She did not, by the constable's later account, speak a word between Clavering and the George. She sat with her hands folded in her lap under the wet cloak, and the frost began again on the fields as the light went, and by the time the chaise came in at the gates of the county jail at Chelmsford, in the first true dark of that January evening, the ruts along the London road had hardened once more into the iron they had been on the morning Hawkes had ridden south. 3 weeks before, and the assize calendar for the following March was, in a chilly room above the gale, already being drawn up by the same clerk who had drawn up the calendar for the assize of 1847, with her name at the head of the second day's business, in a careful copperplate hand. The Scaffold and the Statute. The gaol at Chelmsford in that year stood on Springfield Road, at the northern edge of the town, and it was a brick building with a wall around it that a man on the London road could see from half a mile off. Sarah came in at its gates on the evening of the 6th of January, in the chaise from Clavering, in the black bonnet she had tied at her own hearth an hour before. A turnkey took her name at the wicket. A matron led her to a cell on the women's side of the gale, on the ground floor, with a window high in the wall that gave onto a yard and a stretch of sky. She was left there with a straw pallet and a wool blanket and a tin cup and a candle stub, and the door was locked behind her, and the sound of the key going home in the lock was, by the matron's later account, the first sound that made her lift her head. I want you to hear that key for a moment before we go on, because everything that follows lives on the other side of it. A woman who has walked in and out of her own kitchen for 19 years hears a lock turn that is not hers, and the world she has known ends in that one flat noise. There is no scream after it in the record. There is no letter written. There is only, from the matron's book, the note that the prisoner asked for a second candle stub because the first was already burning down, and that the request was refused, and that the prisoner said, in a level voice, that she understood. The weeks between the 6th of January and the assize in March went by, in her cell, in a way the record can only partly show. She was allowed a Bible. She was allowed, once a week, a visit from the Gaol chaplain, whose name the papers give as the Reverend John Cox, and who had a habit of walking the wing on Wednesday afternoons with his hands folded behind his back. She was not allowed a visit from her one surviving son, who was, by that winter, 18 years old and at labour on a farm 2 parishes off, and who, so far as the visitor's book records, did not, in the whole of those 10 weeks, come to the gate. Whether he had been told not to come, or had chosen not to come, or had not been able to come, the record does not say. The parish papers keep no letter between mother and son from that January. It is one of those places where the sources fall silent, and the honest thing is to say so. She was arraigned at the Chelmsford Assizes on the 11th of March, 1851, before Mr. Baron Park, who had come down from London on the circuit, and who was, by every account of him that survives, a judge who did not tolerate a loose case in his court. The indictment was read in 3 counts. The wilful murder of her husband Richard Chesham by the administration of arsenic. The Crown had, this time, what it had not had 4 years before. It had the report of Alfred Swain Taylor from Guy's Hospital. It had the sworn evidence of Stephen Hawkes, the parish surgeon at Newport. It had the widow from the next cottage. It had the labourer who had helped carry the body to the parish room. It had, over and above all of these, a shelf above a door with a twist of blue paper on the far end of it, which the constable had taken down and had sealed in the presence of the coroner, and which Taylor had tested at Guy's in the same week he had tested the stomach, and which had proved, without any doubt at all, to be arsenic. The trial ran into a second day. She pleaded not guilty. She had no counsel of her own choosing, and the court appointed one for her, a young barrister from the Middle Temple whose name the papers give as Mr. Ballantyne, and who did what a decent man in his position could do, and no more. He put it to Taylor that arsenic in a country cottage was not, in itself, proof of a hand. He put it to Hawkes that a surgeon's private disquiet was not, in itself, evidence of a crime. He drew from the widow Batson the admission that she had never, on any of her visits, seen Sarah put anything into the pot on the hob. He sat down at the end of his address to the jury with a face that told the men in the gallery he had not, in his own mind, expected to be heard. Mr. Baron Park summed up for the greater part of an hour. It was not a hostile summing up. It was a level one. He told the jury the case rested on the finding of arsenic in the several organs of the deceased, in a quantity consistent with a course of administration over several weeks, on the presence of arsenic on the shelf above the door of the kitchen in which the food was cooked, on the flat refusal of the arrowroot sent by the surgeon, and on the 23 years of a marriage in which the wife had had, at every meal of every day, the making of what her husband ate. He asked them to weigh those facts. He did not tell them what to find. They retired at 4:30. They were out for 40 minutes. They came back into the court a little after 5, with a light already going in the lamps along the panelling of the assize hall, and their foreman, a corn merchant from Braintree, stood in the box and answered the clerk's question in one word. Guilty. Mr. Baron Park drew the black cap over his wig. he addressed her by her name. He passed on her the sentence the law of that century still required him to pass, in the form of the words the clerk of the assize had written out for him on a folded sheet, that she should be taken from that place to the place from whence she came, and thence to a place of execution, and there hanged by the neck until she was dead, and that afterwards her body should be buried within the precincts of the gaol. She heard him without moving. She was asked whether she had anything to say. She said she had not. She was taken from the dock by the same wicket she had come in at, in the last of the March light, and led back across the yard to her cell. The chaplain came to her that evening. He came again on every day of the fortnight that followed. What she said to him, in the ordinary way of a prisoner and her chaplain, is not in the papers, and he did not, as some chaplains of that century did, publish a memoir of the visits after her death. His own book keeps only that she was collected in herself, that she took the sacrament on the Sunday before the execution, and that she asked him, on the last evening, whether it would rain in the morning. He said he did not know. It was, by then, a little after 9 at night on the 24th of March, and the wind along Springfield Road was raw out of the east, and the sky over the gale was low, and the man in the porter's lodge, when the chaplain went out at the gate, said he did not much like the look of it for a hanging. The morning was cold and dry. The rain the chaplain had been asked about did not come. The scaffold at Chelmsford Gaol stood then above the main gate on Springfield Road, on a platform that could be seen from the whole of the street below and from the meadow across the way, and it had been set up during the night by 2 men from the county works. William Calcraft, who was hangman for the City of London and for a good half of the county gaols of England in that decade, had come down from London on the mail coach the evening before, and had slept at the gaol, and had come out onto the platform at 8 o'clock, with the rope over his arm. The crowd began to gather at first light. It was, by the papers of the day, a very great crowd, put by the Chelmsford Chronicle at above 7,000 people, which is more than the town of Chelmsford held within its own boundary in that year, and which had come in on foot from the parishes round about, and on carts along the London road, since well before dawn. They filled the length of Springfield Road, from the gate down to the corner by the meadow. They stood on the meadow itself. They were up on the roofs of the low sheds behind the yard of the George. Boys sat in the elms across the road with their legs over the branches. Women had come in aprons under their cloaks. A peaman was among them by 7, with a tray on a strap round his neck, and by 8 he had sold out of what he had brought. I want to slow down here for one honest thing, because it matters more, in the end, than the number in the crowd. That crowd had not, most of it, come for a stranger. It had come, in very large part, from the parishes of Clavering and Newport, and the villages round about them, and it had, most of it, known her name for 6 winters. It had drunk in the taprooms in which the nickname had been given her. It had walked past her gate in the lane. It had crossed the road to the far verge when it saw her coming down from the churchyard. And it had come, that morning, along the London road in the dark, on foot with lanterns and in carts by the score, to stand in Springfield Road at Chelmsford in the March cold and watch her die. Whether that is the ordinary hunger of a country century for a public death, or whether it is a particular hardness of that particular parish toward that particular woman, is not for me to decide for you. I only ask you to hold both readings in your head, because both, I think, are true. She was brought out a few minutes before 9. She came out at the door in the wall beside the gate, between 2 turnkeys, with the chaplain a pace behind her, and she went up the wooden steps to the platform without help. She had asked, in her cell an hour before, whether her hands might be tied in front of her rather than behind, and Calcraft, who had been asked this by many women over many years, had said that they might. He tied them himself, in front of her, at the wrist. He drew a white cap over her head. He set the noose around her neck. The chaplain read the words of the burial service, in the tone in which they had been read at that scaffold many mornings before her. At the last she said one thing that was heard by the turnkeys on the platform beside her, and by the chaplain, and by nobody else along Springfield Road. because a crowd of 7,000 does not hear a voice from under a white cap. What she said, by every one of the several later accounts, was that she was sorry. She did not, in that one sentence, say what she was sorry for. It has been read, since, as a confession to the whole of what the Crown had charged. It has been read, by others, as a wife's sorrow at the end of a life. It has been read as the ordinary word a dying person says to a chaplain, because it is the word that seems, at the end, the only one worth saying. The record does not decide between these readings. The chaplain wrote down what he had heard. He did not, and could not, write down what she had meant. I would rather say that honestly, at the end of an hour we have spent together in her kitchen and her cell, than pretend I know a thing about her that no living soul was in any position to know. Calcraft drew the bolt a little after 9. The platform gave way beneath her. The crowd along Springfield Road made, by the Chronicle's account of the moment, one low sound and then no other sound at all, and stood in the cold for the greater part of the hour it took by the law of that century for a body to be cut down, and it began, then, to disperse along the London road in the same order in which it had come. The sale of Arsenic Bill was read for the first time in the House of Commons on the 10th of June, 3 months after the morning at Chelmsford. It was read a second time on the 24th. It went through its committee stage without much difficulty, because the case at Clavering was, by then, in every paper in the country, and the case at Clavering was not the only such case that year, and the House had, in front of it, a set of returns from the county coroners that made the ordinary member for a country seat uneasy. The bill received the royal assent on the 5th of August 1851. It came into force at once. It required, from that day on, that arsenic sold at a shop counter be coloured with soot or with indigo, so that it could not be taken up by mistake for sugar or for salt. It required that no arsenic be sold to any person not known to the seller. It required that every sale be entered in a book kept for the purpose, with the name of the buyer, and the quantity, and the purpose for which the buyer said it was wanted, and the buyer's mark upon the entry. It closed at a stroke the shop counter at which Sarah Chesham of the cottage at Clavering had, for 19 years, taken down a twist of blue paper on her ordinary weekly walk into Newport. The shelf above the door of the cottage was, by the September of that year, no longer a shelf on which the blue paper lay. The parish papers keep the note that the constable had, in the January before, taken down every twist of it and had sealed each one for the coroner, and that no fresh twist had been laid there in the 8 months since. The cottage itself had by then no tenant. Richard and Sarah had left one living son, who did not, so far as the parish register can tell, ever come back to Clavering to live. The half-acre and the yard and the shelf above the door passed, in the way such things did in that century, to another labouring family from the next parish, whose name is in the tithe book for the following year, and who kept the cottage until the last decade of the century, when it was pulled down for a new farm road, and its 4 low rooms went into the ordinary silence of a village that had, by then, other things to remember. The candle in the porter's lodge at Chelmsford Gale was blown out at the ordinary hour that evening. The wind along Springfield Road turned, in the small hours, into the north. The last of the crowd was, by midnight, home in the parishes it had come from, with its lanterns already put away on the shelves by the doors, and its ordinary talk of the price of wheat, and the state of the roads already back in its mouths. Somewhere in a chilly room in Westminster, a clerk laid the draft of a bill on a desk under a green baize cover and put a candle out beside it and went home. And the history of a woman and a twist of blue paper and a cracked earthenware bowl at a hearth in a cottage in Essex, having come at last to its close, turned, in the dark, one more page and was still.